Welcome to the 8-Bit Instructor Podcast, a show dedicated to helping you level up your instruction in order to craft authentic learning experiences for both you and your students. I'm your host, Lee Tucker, a high school English teacher and ed tech enthusiast, and I want to join you on your journey to becoming the best instructor that you possibly can. So if you're ready, grab your adventuring gear and let's get going. Hey, what's up, 8-Bit crew? Today is Thursday, December 10th, 2020, and this is episode 20 of the 8-Bit Instructor Podcast. Later on in the episode, we'll get to hear the end of my conversation with Asao Inoue about racial injustices and inequalities in the classroom. But before that, we'll take a look at some news and updates around the ed tech world, as well as take a look in the treasure chest for a fun little tip. So we are working our way through December. At my school, we've got a couple of weeks left in the semester, and it's just a lot different this year. It seems to be a little bit heavier, and I've got a lot of stuff weighing on me. And if you do too, hopefully you can find something in the next few weeks to keep you going and keep you encouraged and positive. So hopefully this holiday season will bring some joy to you. In the EdTech news and updates world, I've got some updates from Kami, or Cami maybe. I don't know that I've heard it pronounced. I've always just seen it online, so maybe it's Cami. But Cami, if you don't know, is a PDF editor. It allows you to post PDFs to your students, and they can mark and highlight and all that kind of stuff. And they've just recently released a bunch of updates and betas for Microsoft integration, so be looking out for that if you are a Microsoft user. They are launching a Microsoft Edge extension that allows you to access the Cami site a little bit easier. They're also making improvements for the integrations for Kami and Schoology, or Cami. I don't know. I'm probably saying it wrong. And also, Microsoft users will now get access to Cami's split and merge tools. So those are some new things that are being released and beta tested right now in the coming weeks. Also, coming in December is a Microsoft and Canvas integration for that. And then the other thing for all Cami users is the new Add Media tool. And so it's just a little bit more of an improvement on your ability to insert media. You'll be able to insert images from uploading from your computer, from your Google Drive, or from Google Image Search, as well as inserting videos from your computer, from a Google Drive, or from YouTube. So a lot of new things coming from Cami here in the coming weeks. Also, Google Workspace has released a lot of new updates. So one, there is a new improved PDF importing into Google Docs. So you could upload and convert a PDF into a Google Doc, and they've made some improvements to just make that a little bit easier. If any of you have done that before, the conversion doesn't always go perfectly, but you'll start to see some improvements in the image and text wrapping that's associated with that image, which is one of the things that gets messed up a lot of times on that conversion. Also, you'll see some improvements with text styles and formattings, so a lot better conversion of underlined words or strike-through words, colors, and the ability to have access to more fonts. Also, the layout conversions will see some improvement as well. So you'll get some multi-column layouts, custom page sizes, be able to do tables with borders, and all that kind of stuff. Google and iOS are starting to play together a little bit better. So what you'll notice if you are an iOS user, the new comment interface for Drive, Docs, Sheets, and Slides apps is now rolling out onto the iOS platform. So the new comment interface has a larger, clearer interface to make things easier to read. You'll be able to use shortcuts and gestures to quickly scroll and respond to multiple comments. And also there's the quick access reply to tag or to assign actions. So the little @ feature to tag people, there's a lot easier, quicker way to do that. And finally, my favorite Google Workspace update that came out this week is being able to use custom text in Google Sites. So if you've used Google Sites before, you'll know that you're very limited to whatever theme you've chosen for that Google site. Now they are adding the ability to customize text in text boxes on that site. So you're going to be able to adjust the size, the color, the font, the spacing, all that kind of stuff in text. So basically, a lot of the same things that you can do with text in a Google Doc, you can now do on your Google Sites page. So I'm super excited about that because I like to kind of play around with the design and all that, and I don't always like to use just the standard themes. So if that's you, look forward to that here in the next few weeks. Also, Google Sites coming out in 2021 will be the ability to create your own themes for Google Sites. So you designers out there, be looking forward to that. Well, that's everything for news and updates, so let's go ahead and pop that treasure chest open and see what we've got inside today. Today's treasure chest contains another tip for Google Chrome. This is a huge organizational feature that has been super helpful for me, and that is the ability to group tabs now. So if you right-click on a tab in Google Chrome, you're going to see a new option toward the top that says Add Tab to New Group. And what that does is it's going to group a tab together, and it has a little, kind of like a little colored dot next to it. And if you right click on that colored dot, you can actually name the group, you can choose a color, and then there's other things that you can do with it, like create a new tab in that group. You can close that group, all the tabs in that group. But that has been super helpful for me because if you're like me, I always have probably like 20 to 25 tabs open at one time on my Chrome browser. And a lot of it has to do with some of the different classes that I teach. And so what I've been able to do is I've been able to start grouping and color coding my tabs based on the class that I'm using that tab for. So in my first period class, I'll have all my tabs grouped together. In my third period class, which is a different class, those are grouped together as well. And then if you click on the group name, it will minimize or collapse all of those tabs in the group so you don't see them anymore, and it keeps things a lot more organized. And so I'll close one class period's group out and or collapse it and then open up the other one. So check that out, especially if you find yourself constantly trying to find your different tabs in Google Chrome or anything like that. That has been a huge organizational benefit for me. So in today's boss battle contains the conclusion of my conversation with Asao Inoue. If you missed part 1 of that conversation, make sure to check out last week's episode 19, as we discussed how racial inequalities are present in the classroom. And we talked a little bit more today about what we can actually start to do about that and ways that we can start to change that. So it was a super thought-provoking conversation. I really appreciated Asao talking with me. And so hopefully you will be able to get even more out of this second part of the conversation. So up next is the conclusion of my conversation with Asao Inoue. So, you talked a lot about kind of writing and language, and I know just from studying the last several years, the kind of inherent bias in a lot of the reading curriculum too. That has been something that has been very out there in recent years about, most of the reading curriculum is just, old white guys. And there's not a lot of diversity in the reading that students do. What about like other subject areas? Are you aware, or do you know, are there any of those same kind of like inequality biases in other subject areas?
Oh, well, of course. I think because all academic disciplines in universities and colleges are designed from the same places and people and in the same ways, that it's going to be hard not to. So, that is, if a system is designed or developed within another racist system or white supremacist, it's going to be hard for that system inside, like an educational system or discipline, to not also be white supremacist or racist. So it may not be it in the same ways that, say, English language arts, composition, rhetoric that deals with language and the humanities. But so, for instance, in math, in mathematics, I know there's been some really interesting work over the years done on stereotype threat. There's a psychologist named Claude Steele, who's done some really, really important work on. His team and him started looking at the ways that women were discriminated against in the mathematics fields by looking at their disproportionate failure rates or lower rates in math tests in college. Mm-hmm. So they were looking at college students and trying to find out, why are the women in these classrooms performing noticeably lower than their male counterparts? Is it that women just simply don't have the same kind of math skills inherently, or what's going on? Well, turns out they do, and the way they found out that they do have the same skills is that they did some experiments, and they found out that, of course, because math, like science and engineering, is such a male-dominated field in terms of the class, who's in the classroom, who's teaching it, and who they're reading, what they're that all of that a woman or a young woman would see in college is men everywhere around her, and the absence of women, and the message is, women aren't very good at math or at science or engineering, and so that stereotype of women not being good at math affects them. When you take the stereotype out, all of a sudden they perform much, much better and right up to their peers. Claude Steele did the same work with African Americans in college across different courses, and found the same pattern that it requires a magic number. That is, I think it was something like a third. You need to have a third of the students in that room to be black in order before black stereotype threat on tests, regardless of what they were, language or math or whatever, to go away. That is, you need to be able to know that there's other people in the room like you who can achieve and are achieving, and then you will not feel like the burden of the stereotype as much anymore. So that's really, to me, that was a pretty important work to think about in terms of the way implicit racial bias and also stereotype threat works in any field, no matter where you're at. So because, of course, academia, by and large, is dominated by white men, and more increasingly in the humanities, white men and women. So you have to account for that somehow.
Do you think that's kind of the same issue with like the different levels of classes, like honors classes versus a regular ed class?
You mean like who's in the room, who gets to be in those rooms? Oh, absolutely. I'm just thinking about the ways in which, and we're trying to change this right now at Arizona State. We have honors class, like an honors English class. So for instance, if you come in, you have to take a first year writing class, right? Like everybody does, unless you test into the honors class. And the only way to test into an honors class is to be able to take that class, which then allows you to have to take one class as opposed to two classes. So it actually is cost effective and it accelerates your time to graduation, and it frees up some elective credit, and it also gives you that distinction of being in the honors class, and that means you get to be in the honors college, which is a really big deal for a lot of students. So there's a lot of advantages to being tested into that, but of course it's a very white space.
Right.
In a state that's not that white. I mean, Arizona, right?
Right.
So what's going on there? Well, of course, the white supremacist testing scores that they use AccuPlacer, and in the past years before COVID, they use SAT or ACT scores. We've waived all those. We're not taking those because of you just can't take those tests, right?
Right.
Because of that, we've had to find other ways, and we're actually trying to work with the university, a group of writing program administrators, myself included, working with the university to even get rid of that, even rethink this. Because again, it doesn't change that dynamic. What it'll do is all the students of color are going to be in the normal writing class, and then the upper end of the white students will all be in those honors classes, and all you'll get are white students in those honors classes, and there's going to be another white space. So because those tests end up still using one standard, that elite white middle class and standard of language.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I mean, when I thinking through that, it's so much to kind of take in and process, and when I think about, okay, well, you know, what's the next step there? You know, obviously.
Yeah, the trouble with all this is that you can take the next step, but the next step will show you that there's other steps you should have taken.
Yeah.
and that there's even more steps ahead, right? So, but it doesn't mean that we should not take the steps. It just means that we have to remember that it's a very, very steep hill, and it's a very long hill that we're trying to climb. I'm reminded of I think you mentioned in an email to me. I'm reminded of Michelle Alexander's. You got me thinking about her.
Yeah.
Her book now that was on the incarceration system in the United States, and how that is a sort of new Jim Crow, as she says.
Yeah.
But it's the same system. It's the same kind of system as the educational system in the United States. That is. There's a passage there in that book in which she discusses the bird cage metaphor for white supremacy and racism. It's this mini wired cage that you can snip a wire, but yet you're still trapped in that racist cage.
Yeah,
and that's exactly, I think, what we're trying to talk through, which is we can do a labor-based grading contract in a classroom, but the classroom still has other wires that make it racist or make the environment racist, and it's not going to solve all the problems.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and I know the quote that I sent you, I was going to read it real quick because I think it kind of fits with this idea that you're talking about with the cage. And she says the system of control, talking about mass incarceration, depends far more on racial indifference, defined as a lack of compassion and caring about race and people belonging to a certain racial groups, rather than racial hostility, a feature it actually shares with its predecessors. And so I think that's kind of where I've come to in this kind of idea of like, well, what's the solution? Because, you know, years ago it was we're colorblind, like I don't see color, right? And I hear that, you know, I hear that a good bit from even like students in my classroom, and I don't know, like it just when I read something like that indifference is the problem, not outright hostility. That's a really, really important, I think, concept to try to figure out how to work, especially when you're thinking about, because what I'm hearing you talk about is how do I work with my students on these ideas? Like, even if subtly, but how do I work? Because, you certainly don't want them to continue to go through their lives thinking a colorblindness is a good solution, right? To thinking about race in the world. It's not a bad thing to think about race. It's more harmful, I think, to assume that racism and white supremacy
are problems of the heart. I personally, I've said this to many crowds and many groups, I personally do not care what your heart tells you. I do not care about what your intentions are, how good you feel about other people or not, or what you are hoping to accomplish with something. That does not matter. It's never mattered. It's just has had very little bearing on the outcomes in history. When we look at the long arm of history,
right,
what's mattered more is not the intentions or the beliefs of people, but the structures that created all of us and the structures that confine us. So I think those steps and the way to think about it is when we're thinking about how do we talk about racism with our students, I think it's about thinking, hey, this is not a personal issue. That is, we don't have to talk about it as a personal issue. Instead, let's think about racism as this larger structural problem that creates indifference, that creates that allows you to not have to think about the pain and suffering of other people. When if you were in pain and suffering, you would hope that somebody would be thinking about you and trying to solve the problem with you. But we can alleviate ourselves because we can have other excuses, like say, well, it must have been their fault. I mean, we live in a meritocratic society. It must be their fault because they didn't try hard enough, or they didn't do this, or they didn't do that. When we know that our lives are always filled with constraints, as much as we have affordances that we can do things, right? But there's constraints. We all can't just do anything we want. I'm pretty sure that not everybody in my classroom has the ability to be president of the United States. Right. Even though I think everybody ought to have the opportunity to be president of the United States. But they're not. They don't have the pathways, the people to know, the avenues, all the things that are required to do that kind of a job. So I think those things, we have to figure out a way to talk about the systems and how those systems inevitably lead back to us, like to our actions, to our beliefs, and so forth. And that it's not a detriment. It's not an insult to say what you said there was racist, or because. But when I say that, I'm saying I understand why you say that, because you grew up in, like myself, in racist systems that encourage you, that reward you to say or believe those things, to be indifferent to other people's sufferings. Right. Those are not humane systems. Those are inhumane systems, because they leave out most of the people on the planet. I mean, they just historically always, most of the people on the planet don't get to have the luxuries that we have, like mandatory schooling, college. Those are realistic goals that people can set for themselves in the United States. They may not be realistic for everybody, but for most people, I think they are. But not the case in most of the world and most of history, right? These are not things that they could hope to aspire to. Right.
So to kind of wrap up my last thing, and I don't know, this, when I say last thing, it could probably still be another hour conversation kind of deal. How do we take this idea and then just on a day-to-day, what are some practical things that we can do to kind of shift? Like to use the birdcage metaphor, what are some of those things that we can start to clip maybe in our classrooms? I know the standardized stuff we already kind of talked about. Is there anything else that you've found useful, helpful?
Yeah, so I'll give an overarching thing that will, I think, apply to a lot of different kinds of situations in classrooms, because I don't know all the different conditions that teachers find themselves in with students and so forth, and administrators, and because I think those details are important, like to decide what can I do tomorrow in my classroom, right? So the number one thing I think in order to be an anti-racist teacher is to embody that and do that work. Is an orientation to anti-racism. Okay. And if we don't have an orientation to it, we won't see the opportunities to see what's the next little thing I can do that's doable, that's achievable, that I can do with my students or whatever it is, or with my principal or my colleagues around me. That's really, really vital. And it's hard to cultivate it because it's a habitual thing, right? It has to be like, I would never have come to, for instance, labor-based grading contracts as an anti-racist a solution or application to my classrooms if I hadn't had an orientation to thinking, how can I break this racist system that's hurting my students and me? Mm-hmm. How do I break it? So that's part of my orientation. How do I break it? How do I see my classroom as a system that's created outside of me in part and that's controlling me and my students in some ways that we do not want? Mm-hmm. I know my students don't want to be racist or white supremacist as much as I don't want to be. No matter what their political or otherwise their backgrounds, I know we all want to live in a fair and just and wonderful world that's where everybody's happy and everyone gets all the opportunities they can and everyone gets to have all the things they want to have. We don't live in that world. I don't know if we ever could live in that world, but we all want it. Yeah. because we all want that. I think it's worth pursuing how to break the current system that creates so many ways for us not to have that. That is, it's like, for instance, capitalism. Just to use one obvious aspect of our society and culture, capitalism is built on inequality. Mm-hmm. It demands it. It demands that somebody makes more money than somebody else. It demands that there's a finite set of resources in the system so that it can be funneled in particular ways because that's how value is created in that system. All right. So same thing with grades. You have a grading system, you have an A to F or whatever the system is. One grade is better than the other, and you want to, and the students want to try to achieve the highest grade or the best grade. And the only way that grade is the best and the highest is if few of them are given. So here's an easy way to see how deeply this is ingrained in all of us as teachers. And I did this. I didn't realize I came across this early on when I was in graduate school. All you've got to do is blindly, try not to grade any. You get a stack of papers that you get, right? That you have to grade, right, or evaluate. Let's say you take 25 of them. A typical first year writing class would have about 25 students in them. Let's say you have that. Don't grade them. Read them and put them in 4 simple piles. And make those piles hierarchical. The best papers over on the left, the worst papers on the right. Don't worry about why they're that. Just read them and holistically decide and see how many end up in each pile. Don't try to manage those numbers. Just do it and see. And what you'll find, if you're like most everybody else, is that most of those piles are going to be in the middle. And there's only going to be a 1 or 2 maybe in that classroom of 25. They're going to be at that number one, that highest pile. There's going to be 1 or 2 there, and there's going to be a couple on the end. And that's because we have been so ingratiated into bell curves and natural distributions that we're going to find them we're going to find them and craft them in our own judgment practices. And we have to try to figure out how do we decraft ourselves out of that. That's an anti-racist orientation, to say, wait a minute, I'm automatically naturally reading these in these piles. How do I not read them in those piles? How do I make my reading not a bell curve? So that's what I had to figure out how to do. And the best way I knew how to do it early on was to stop grading. And stop making myself have to put linearly rank students and rank performances. And once I did that, then all of a sudden a new set of questions opened up for me as a reader and teacher, which was, well, what is in this thing to value? What is in this thing that I don't understand or don't like? And then how do I respond? And then the next batch, the deeper batch, which is the really important stuff, is why do I have those ideas and expectations about where did I get those? What are my sources? There's my colonizing, right? That's where I find, I don't have any. I went to graduate school. It took me into graduate school before I started reading a significant amount of authors of color from my field. Now, what the heck's going on there? How did that happen? I thought my professors were pretty good, and they were, but they didn't give me a lot of experience with writers of color who are writing about composition and rhetoric and teaching of writing, and I needed that. And that's partly because of the systems weren't built that way. They're overdetermined towards whiteness. There weren't a lot of scholars who were black or indigenous or Latin scholars who were writing composition and rhetoric, texts and textbooks and such. So of course they wouldn't have many to choose from. But that in itself is a problem. Right? We should have been pointing to that and seeing that as a problem. So all these things we can start tracing back, and once we start having that orientation towards anti-racism, it's really an orientation towards anti-systems. And that doesn't mean we tear down systems and have anarchy. It just means we tear down systems to build better ones, the ones that we want, that will give us the outcomes that we want. Every system, whether it's an assessment system, a grading system, a school system, is built to create a very particular outcome. And the outcomes are engineered because these things, schools, tests, only really do one thing. They engineer society. And the engineers were built or built these things a long time ago. Depending on which one we're talking about. And those engineers were all white guys, all white men. And they had very particular biases and so forth. And if we just take the systems that we inherit, then we inherit all those biases and all those engineering biases. Now we get the society we have today, which is exactly what we've done, right? And then we wonder, why are all of my black students not performing well?
Yeah.
Well, because you're not putting them in a system that will allow them to perform well.
Right.
So you've made systems. We have systems inherited systems that let only very narrow bandwidth of students to perform well. And so I think once we see what we're operating from as inherently already problematic, it doesn't mean that it all has to be thrown out the window. It just means we need to rethink and rebuild.
Yeah,
that's all. And that takes a lot of work, and it also means you're going to fail a lot of the time.
Right.
There's going to be lots of people who are going to not let you do what you really want to do, and that can be disheartening.
Yes.
But I don't think it means we give up.
Well, awesome.
Yeah.
Hey, I really appreciate that. That's a lot of great ideas, great thoughts. So
thank you. I appreciate the time.
Yeah. Well, that was Asao Inoue. Make sure to follow him online. He's on Twitter at Asao Inoue, and check out his website and blog at asaoinoue.com. Next up is the 8-Bit Crew Members Board. So last week's question of the week was more of a reflection and looking at identifying where we see inequalities in our classrooms and in our schools. This week takes on a little bit more of a practical application to that idea. And what I want to know this week is, what will you do moving forward to try to ensure that your classroom is a more equitable place for students? So I've been thinking about that as I've been listening back over this conversation that I had with Asao, and I had a few things that I wanted to try to start doing. Some are, I guess, more ideological, and some are a lot more practical. So one, I definitely want to do what I can to try to get more minorities in my honors classes so that it is not just predominantly white. And that is something that I think will take time because it requires working with other teachers and kind of sharing the goal with other teachers and getting them to buy into it. On a more practical level, I've already worked on trying to get a lot more readings of diverse authors and diverse characters, so I want to continue doing that. But I also want to try to give my students a lot more of a voice. And so when Asao mentioned the idea of a third being that magic number, while I can't always control that, I can try to control how my students have a voice in my classroom. And so I do want to take time to talk to my different students and get feedback from them on whether or not things that I'm doing in class are fair and equitable. So I do want to start getting a lot more of that feedback from a equality kind of point of view. So what are some of those things that you want to implement into your class? You can share your ideas on Twitter. You can tag me at Comic Socks and use the hashtag 8BitCrew. You can also leave feedback on the episode page at 8bitinstructor.com. Well, many thanks to Asao Inoue for joining me last week and this week. Make sure to check him out online and look in the show notes for links to some of his publications. I read his labor-based instruction book this summer, and it was very integral in some of the changes I made in my class this year. And there's also a link to his anti-racist writing assessment ecologies book that is on my to-read list. If you enjoyed this show, make sure to hit subscribe on whatever app you use to get your podcasts, and feel free to leave a review. Also, tell others about it and help us to increase the reach of the 8-Bit Crew community. If you want to support the show, you can do so on Patreon by going to patreon.com/8bitinstructor. Well, that will just about wrap up this episode. Hey, to those of you who are finishing up a semester with a week or two left, hang in there, keep going strong, finish strong, and just know that I appreciate everything that you are doing out there. And until next week, may your swords stay sharp and your shields hold strong. Thanks so much for listening. Be sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and check out the 8-Bit Instructor YouTube channel for EdTech tips and tutorials, as well as other content on my website, 8bitinstructor.com. And of course, don't forget to follow me on Twitter @ComicSocks and use the hashtag 8BitCrew. See you next week. So today's treasure chest contains...